Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Excited to be here.
Today, we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. Freedom, power, justice.
The big ones.
We've got some help, though, from three giants of political thought. Hobbes, Locke, and Hayek.
Yeah, these are the thinkers who really laid the groundwork for how we understand these concepts even today.
Definitely. Now, I know what you're thinking. Philosophy. Could be a little dry.
A little dense, maybe?
But trust me on this one, these guys were wrestling with ideas that are still so relevant today, especially in our world. And we're going to make those connections crystal clear.
And hopefully make you think a little differently about the world around you.
Exactly. So let's start with someone who, well, let's just say he had a pretty dim view of human nature, old Thomas Hobbes.
Oh yeah, Hobbes was not known for his optimism.
He had this idea called the state of nature. Imagine a world with no rules, no government, pure anarchy.
So basically, every man for himself.
Pretty much. What do you think that would actually look like, though?
Well, Hobbes described it as a war of all against all.
A war of all against all.
Keshi?
Where life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Not exactly selling it, but would it be free?
It would be free in the sense that there'd be no laws or anyone to answer to, but with no one to protect you from others.
Right.
It would basically be a constant struggle for survival.
Okay, so total freedom, but at a pretty steep price. So
Yeah.
how did we ever escape this state of nature, according to Hobbes?
Well, he believed that humans, driven by fear, essentially make a deal.
A deal.
Yeah, we give up some of our freedom to a powerful ruler, a sovereign,
In exchange for...
protection, security,
Oh.
a break from that whole war of all against all thing.
Makes sense. So we're trading some individual liberty for a system of rules, laws, and the peace of mind that comes with knowing someone's got your back.
That's the social contract in a nutshell.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. And it's interesting, right? Because we still see this tension today, the balance between individual freedom and collective security.
Oh, absolutely. Think about surveillance programs, airport security, or laws limiting free speech in the name of national security.
It's everywhere.
All echoes of this Hobbesian idea. We're always navigating this line. How much freedom are we willing to give up in exchange for safety and security?
And it's a question with no easy answers. Sometimes those lines get really blurry, which brings us to a real-world case where this very dilemma played out, the Belmarsh case in the UK.
Right. This wasn't just theoretical. This had real consequences.
So after 9/11, the UK passed a law that allowed for indefinite detention of foreign nationals suspected of terrorism.
Indefinite detention without trial.
Without trial. That sounds, I don't know, extreme.
It was definitely controversial,
Yeah.
and it eventually ended up in the highest court in the land.
Yeah.
The question was, could the government justify locking people up, potentially forever, without a trial?
Wow. So on the one hand, you want to keep people safe, but on the other, indefinite detention without a trial. That feels like it violates some fundamental rights.
Exactly. And that's where the European Convention on Human Rights became central to the case.
Because it protects things like the right to a fair trial.
Right. And freedom from arbitrary detention. So the judges had to determine if this indefinite detention violated the convention.
So what happened? Did the courts side with the government or uphold individual rights?
In a landmark ruling, they actually sided against the government.
Wow. Okay, so even in the face of fear, the courts upheld the principle of due process.
They acknowledged the threat of terrorism, but they said indefinite detention without trial, that's a step too far. They actually called it an anathema to the rule of law.
That's a powerful statement. It seems like there's always this push and pull when it comes to security and freedom. Is there any way to guarantee both?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that brings us perfectly to our next philosophical heavyweight, John Locke.
Okay, so Locke, less doom and gloom than Hobbes.
A bit more optimistic, you could say. Locke believed that even without an all-powerful ruler, humans weren't destined to just descend into chaos.
He had a little more faith in humanity, it sounds like.
He did. He believed in natural rights.
In natural rights.
The idea that we have certain rights just by virtue of being human.
Like what?
Life, liberty, property. These rights, he said, they pre-exist any government.
So not granted by kings or governments, but inherent to being human.
Exactly. And he believed these rights could be understood through reason and experience.
Okay, so how did that work in practice?
Well, take his theory of property, for example. He said property rights come from labor. You know the saying, mixing your sweat with the soil.
Right, so if you put in the work, you have a right to the fruits of your labor. Makes sense.
It does, but it gets complicated. You see, Locke's ideas, while revolutionary, they also had some unintended and frankly tragic consequences.
Oh, how so?
Well, his focus on individual ownership and the cultivation of land, it played a role in justifying colonialism.
Wait, colonialism, how did that happen?
Well, his model of property didn't quite translate to societies that didn't operate on the same principles as Europe at the time. Indigenous populations, for example, they might have had more communal systems of land ownership.
Right.
They didn't necessarily fit into Locke's definition.
So even though he believed in these universal natural rights, his definition of property ended up being used to dispossess people of their land.
Sadly, yes. It was used to justify the seizure of land from indigenous populations all over the world, seen as unclaimed territory, right for the taking.
That's a dark side to an idea that was meant to promote freedom. And what about his views on slavery? How do those fit in?
That's another complicated aspect of Locke's legacy. He personally opposed slavery,
Okay.
but he made exceptions for those he considered enemies of humanity.
Enemies of humanity. Who did he have in mind?
Well, he included those who resisted colonial rule or those who didn't conform to European norms of, well, rationality and behavior, let's say,
So basically anyone who didn't fit into his worldview.
essentially. And as you can imagine, that was used to justify some pretty horrific things.
It's almost like his ideas were used to justify the very things he was against.
It's a contradiction, for sure.
Yeah.
And it highlights the complexities of his legacy.
It's like we're always grappling with this tension between individual liberty and the common good.
It's the never-ending debate.
It really is. But speaking of individual liberty, it's time to bring in our third thinker, Friedrich Hayek, a 20th century guy who really shook things up.
Hayek, now there's a thinker who really championed free markets and individual freedom.
Yeah, and he was a big critic of government intervention in the economy, right? I mean, his ideas are still hugely influential today.
Oh, absolutely. Shaping economic policy in many parts of the world.
So how does Hayek connect back to what we've been talking about with Hobbes and Locke?
Well, Hayek was all about this idea of spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order. That sounds kind of messy.
Not exactly. He believed that complex systems, like the economy, don't function best when they're centrally controlled.
Okay, so no puppet masters.
Right. He believed these systems work better when they're allowed to evolve naturally, guided by the decisions of individuals.
So kind of like a self-organizing system?
Exactly. And he argued that this spontaneous order arises from individuals pursuing their own self-interest.
So he's saying the best way to promote the common good is to let individuals pursue their own interests. That sounds a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
That's the beauty of it, though. Hayek saw the market not as some cold, heartless machine, but as a reflection of individual choices, all those choices adding up to something greater.
Okay, so less government, more individual freedom. Sounds a lot like classical liberalism, like we were talking about with Locke.
There are definitely parallels.
But what about social justice? How did Hayek's ideas about individual liberty and limited government fit in with creating a fairer society?
That's where things get interesting. Hayek was very skeptical of the concept of social justice.
Wait, skeptical. He didn't believe in it.
He believed that while individuals could be just or unjust, trying to impose a specific outcome on society, like economic equality, was misguided, even dangerous.
Dangerous. How so?
He believed it led down a slippery slope. That even well-intentioned attempts to redistribute wealth would require more and more government control.
And that's a bad thing because...
He believed it could ultimately lead to tyranny, the loss of individual freedom.
So, for example, something like universal basic income, where everyone gets a certain amount of money from the government, Hayek wouldn't be a fan.
He'd probably argue that it distorts market signals and could disincentivize work.
Interesting. So for Hayek, individual freedom, a free market, those were the ultimate goals, even if it meant accepting some degree of inequality.
That was his view. He believed that trying to force equality would ultimately undermine individual liberty.
I see what you mean. So we've gone from Hobbes's rather bleak view of human nature to Locke's ideas about natural rights and the complexities of their legacy. And now we've got Hayek, this champion of individual freedom and the power of the free market. It's a lot to process.
It is, but they all get at these fundamental questions: the role of government, individual freedom versus collective security, what it means to have a just society.
Questions that are still so relevant today. So where does that leave us?
I think it leaves us with the challenge of continuing to think critically about these issues, to engage with these different perspectives, and to figure out for ourselves what we believe.
Because there are no easy answers.
There aren't. But by engaging with these thinkers, their ideas, their limitations, we can better understand the challenges we face today and hopefully find a way to build a better future.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Anytime.